Finally, after 100 years, survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre were finally able to have their voices heard on Capitol Hill. Today, 3 survivors of the massacre were invited to testify before a House Judiciary subcommittee to discuss the event and the reparations lawsuit filed last year against the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa. Survivor Loyola Fletcher delivered passionate and powerful testimony during the hearing. The 170-year-old Fletcher discussed America's attempt to erase the legacy of the massacre and how she relives it every day.
I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot.
Ms. Fletcher also touched on Tulsa's history of profiting off the massacre without paying any restitution to survivors such as herself.
To this day, I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while, the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa.
Ms. Fletcher had this to say regarding the city of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce.
For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes.
Joining us to discuss this hearing is Loyola Marymount University professor Eric Miller. Eric, how are you, Professor?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
You gave passionate, very convincing testimony today about why reparations are deserved by, these survivors and their descendants. Could you just refresh that briefly for our listeners?
So the city of Tulsa, as you mentioned, has not paid a single cent to the survivors or the descendants for destroying 35 city blocks and burning down all their houses. As we heard at the hearing, things got even worse. The survivors were prevented from gaining insurance payments. Banks wouldn't honor the money that they deposited because their bank books had been burned. And all this was at the behest of the city of Tulsa, which deputized a number of individuals to act as police, as did the county sheriff's department. So the county, the state, and as you mentioned, the National Guard acted for the states. The state, the county, and the city were prime movers in the Tulsa race massacre.
Professor Miller, I also have joining our conversation now is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, who is also a great-granddaughter of Rebecca Brown Crutcher, a survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. We've been discussing, Dr. Crutcher, the idea of reparations being owed. In your speech today, you also talked about the need for reparations. What is your perspective on those reparations, just so our viewers get kind of caught up to speed on this?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Mr. Blow, for having me. Of course, I didn't learn about the massacre until I went off to college, and everybody from all around the country would ask me, where are you from? And I would say Tulsa, and they would immediately say Black Wall Street. I went home, asked my dad, what are these people talking about? And that's when he shared with me that my great-grandmother, Rebecca Brown Crutcher, had to flee in fear of her life. She left her business. She came back, tried to rebuild, but urban renewal came back and destroyed our beloved community yet again, and she went off to Kansas City. But there's been no atonement. There's been no restitution. There's been no repayment. We were robbed of our generational wealth. And I often sit back and think, Charles, what would my life look like if this massacre didn't take place? You know, where would we be? And so we believe that restitution are owed. We went to Congress today and we asked them to help us get reparations for Tulsa, and also really take a vote on H.R. 40 immediately.
One thing we didn't talk about earlier in this show, and I just want to just stay on this with you, Dr. Crutcher, for just 1 second. It is remarkable to me how history fades from generation to generation. The fact that you are a direct descendant of one of the people who survived that massacre, and you did not know because it was not transmitted, you know, through family, but also it was not part of the city history. And the city itself had a coordinated campaign to erase this event. And you know, what's shocking to me is that it works. You know, it actually works. You are able to erase history in that way. Is that shocking to you in the same way?
Yes, it really, really is, Charles. It was a conspiracy of silence. They forced my great-grandmother into silence and said, if you ever said anything about it, you would be next. And that was the common thread. That was the common story that was passed down to several families, to a lot of the families that experienced this racial terror violence. And, you know, even today, real time, our Governor Stitt, just passed the bill into law, House Bill 1775, saying that educators would be penalized if they taught critical race theory, which really threatens truth-telling in this country. It threatens talking about what happened, and we understand that if whoever controls the past, they control the future. And so, you know, what happened 100 years ago is still pervasive today, is still being perpetuated, and they're still forcing us into silence through policies and laws in Oklahoma.
Professor Miller, if we establish that the descendants and survivors of the massacre deserve undoubtedly to be paid reparations, who owes it? Is it the city? Is it the state? Does the federal government have a part in paying reparations to these descendants? Is it corporate America, the banks and the insurance offshoots? Oftentimes these banks get folded into bigger banks than they exist today. Or is it just everyone?
So it's closer to everyone. And the reason is that there were so many different entities and institutions involved in the massacre that the responsibility for repaying the victims is spread over the banks, over the city, over the county, over the state, and over the Chamber of Commerce, who hushed up this massacre after it happened, refused funds from philanthropists, black people around the nation who sent money, and tried to control the story of the massacre. And so you've talked a little bit about critical race theory. It strikes me that it's critical race theory when black Americans want to tell their history, but it's not critical race theory when the city of Tulsa wants to tell the history, when the white Chamber of Commerce wants to tell the history. And so it's that erasure that's really worrying, and it's those individuals who are now profiting off the history who themselves owe the descendants and the survivors the money.
Dr. Miller, Dr. Crutcher, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it.